Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming for what is, I expect, an unusual topic, which is not too surprising for a lot of my work. But I think the intersection between humanity and computing is really very interesting, because humanity is a very messy world, and technology attempts to reduce complexity and standardize. And that intersection, for me, creates a lot of interest. So today we're talking about names, but in all of my previous talks, I've not explained what it is that I do. And a lot of people over the last few months have said, I've been looking for, I wish I could. And I thought, well, we've got some of that. Perhaps that would be useful to you. So I'm not going to go through this. Of course, it's in the deck. You'll have it. But it turns out I've been doing quite a lot in Elixir for the last several years. And I hope that you might find some of it useful. And there's a few other things that I've been working on as well. So to the topic at hand, in the beginning, there was Adam. And life was quite simple. Adam had a name. Now, it turns out, because I want to be really clear that that's the largely Anglo-Saxon Christian view of history, that after Adam came Adam and Eve, and we introduced genders. Good, but still, we just had a name. Now, it turns out that that single name approach is quite consistent in most human cultures. If we think about Chinese culture, there are many origin myths, but Pangu is considered to be the proto-human, a single name. And in the Hindu world, Manu is considered similarly to be an original human. Please forgive me for not understanding the cultural nuances. I have enough trouble in my own culture, but I hope that you get the point. For most of human history, people had a name. And I can assure you the idea of having to format names, present them to people, and engage with them in the way that they would wish to be engaged has not been an issue. But by the time we get to the Middle Ages, a little bit earlier in China, around about the year 1000, tax collectors started to have a problem. And I'm sure you're well aware that tax collection drives most cultures and economies, because eventually and ultimately collecting tax becomes the function of the state or community. And interestingly, this idea of the single name, by the time we get to the Middle Ages in England, the two names John and William just themselves alone accounted for over 20% of all of the male names in England. Agnes was one of the top three names, and you don't hear that very often anymore for female names. And you can imagine that if you're a tax collector and you get on your horse and you ride around the countryside and you turn up in a town and you say, John, you owe me 25 pounds, then all of the Johns are going to disappear, or they're all going to say, no, it's the other John. So the idea of an additional name to disambiguate which John I mean is largely driven by both inbreeding, when everyone's called John, or tax collection. So for today, we'll go with tax collection. So it started to be John the Butcher, John the Baker, John the Miller, John the something or other else, especially in Anglo-Saxon communities. And it's therefore quite familiar, I'm sure, to everyone here that that becomes a formalized way of creating an additional name by which we can disambiguate which John or William or Bruce we happen to know. And every culture around the world has come up with a different way of expressing that second name. Patronymic and matronymic names are culturally probably the most common, and in most European, whether West or East, are deeply embedded in the naming systems and cultures. A little bit different in other cultures, and it varies a lot. Cognominal was a new name that I learned, so I'll have to use it because it's such a good word, based upon appearance or behavior. Little John, somebody short, so-and-so Schwarzkopf. Occupational is fairly obvious. Toponymic, I've forgotten to update the names, but that's my fault. Ornamental, and ornamental is an interesting one because this is the point at which lords and ladies or royalty have given themselves very flowery family names to which they can attach themselves to fame and fortune. And then you start to get other people trying to also create names to make themselves feel as if they could be a lord or lady, but perhaps may not be. So by the time we get to the late Middle Ages around the world, the Middle Ages I know is a European thing, but let's say the 1500s to 1600s, then we've got a fairly consistent use of additional names to describe why that John's different from this other John. In the UK, started about 1066 with William the Conqueror, which is why it's a tax issue around the Doomsday Book. If you've ever watched MASH, then you know this name, but I suspect most of you haven't seen MASH because you're all much too young. But there's a character in MASH with a lovely name called Charles Emerson Winchester. So we get the introduction of not a given name and not a family name or last name, but a middle name, further disambiguation in part, and often in part as a way of honouring ancestors while still being attached to a different family name. And I think at this point, we'd probably still say, I don't need no fancy software to address this person by mail or in the pub. But then things get more complicated because then for some reason, people decide to create more ambiguity when we've gone through 1,000 years of removing ambiguity. And so now we're going to say that Charles Emerson Winchester is a very fabulous name to which I feel deeply attached. So I'm going to call my son by the same name. How to disambiguate. Now we put a generational indicator on there as a matter of personal pride and significant ego. So now it's getting a little bit more difficult to work out how we should address people in an unambiguous fashion. And then we get attached to how good we feel. It's more ego getting in the way, probably. But now I'm a doctor, and a doctor is a very special person, ignoring the fact that not that long ago, doctors and barbers were the same thing, and it was a little bit confusing about whether you were doctoring or barbering, but it used sharp implements in all cases, and therefore could be quite interesting. So now I want to add my credentials as a feeling of my own personal worth. And if that wasn't enough, then we decide that Charles Emerson Winchester III, MD, is quite a mouthful, so let's just call him Chuck, which is an interesting derivation, how you get from Charles to Chuck. There are disputed views on how that happens. One of them is that it comes from the German, but we blame the Germans for lots of things, so who knows whether that's really true or not. But now we introduce the idea of an informal given or first name, and we start to separate the idea of addressing you formally and addressing you informally. And how and when we do that is, of course, a cultural decision, and it differs quite widely by culture. You could almost say that in the majority of Japanese cultural engagements, formal and informal are inseparable. And in some cases, in other countries, it's also true. Of course, our Spanish friends are far more effusive, far emotive, much more culturally engaged. And so one given name, not nearly enough. One family or surname, also not nearly enough. So now we have to introduce not only other given names, plural, but additional family names. And depending upon the communication context, use one or the other or both. Typically in this case, and good on Spanish cultures here, inheriting names from both the matriarchal side and the patriarchal side at the same time, and therefore being far more open-minded, still adding generations. And now we introduce a title as well. So it's unlikely that if Miguel Angel is a good friend of mine, that when we're down the pub, I introduce myself when we catch up for a beer by this full name. So I need to have some way of working out who am I talking to, what is the relationship we have with each other, what is the formality that I need to apply. And then it gets even a little more interesting, and I just love this word, so forgive me for including the site. This is the name of the Prince of Liechtenstein. That's his full name. And I'm using this as an example to introduce not just the complexity, because I'm sure that his wife doesn't call him by this name, but introduces the von und zu. Von, I think you've probably heard many times in German names, quite common, which means I'm from this place. And zu und zu is a reflection of originally my ancestors killed everyone in this place and took this bit of land over, and my family still's got it. So when it's Fon und Su, it means the Prince of Liechtenstein's family came one day with a bunch of axes and swords, took the land, and they've still got it. Let's face it, everyone's ancestors took the land from somebody else, and we're not immune from that in this country or culture either. The Dutch have a delightful word for this, what I'm calling surname prefix, which is tussenvolksel. Although that's not a very good Dutch accent, please forgive me, I don't speak any language except a dialect of English. And it's just extended a little bit further in the idea of titles, sometimes called honorifics, but that's a little bit different and it varies. This is the name of the previous king of Thailand, and His Royal Highness, translated into Thai script and in English version of Thai, is very, very long, and I won't attempt a Thai translation at all. So my objective at this point is to say that names have significant meaning to the people that hold them. The manner in which people are addressed is a reflection of the relationship we have with that person, the purpose and manner of which we make that communication, and a lot of intent behind what we're trying to do. For example, a letter addressed to you from the Assistant Commissioner of Taxation carries a lot of import and weight, and it's highly likely to include your full legal name. If you were, for some strange reason, to be invited by the King of England to receive an award, it's also very likely that it would be addressed in a very formal fashion, using your title, given name, middle names, last names, titles, honors, and everything else that could be thrown into the kitchen sink. But when you go home to your parents' house and your mother discovers you've been doing something bad, the way she addresses you is quite different. And in between, there are a significant number of variations, all of which have importance. Some of it because it's simply polite and good manners. But of a lot of it, especially in the social, online, and commerce world, becomes a reflection of how I consider my relationship with you. Beginning of this presentation, I put up my name and I said, Kip is my informal given name, which is true. My legal name is far more complex and a lot longer, and is something that I can thank my parents for every single day. The result of which is that if I receive mail from someone that I give money to invest, or a service from which I buy, or something else, and I'm addressed by my full legal name, I do not like it, because it says they don't care. They're not interested. And I will typically engage more strongly with organizations that are respectful of what I ask them to call me. Now, that makes me a little bit of an extremist. That's not unusual either. So this, for me, is the motivation for why we should care. It's because we all have the right, I believe, to be addressed as we would wish. And we are sensitive to the context in which we are called by the name that we use. Now, as software developers, we would rank this as an issue towards the bottom 5% of issues we consider when we wake up in the morning, in most cases. Because at the end of the day, if I've actually got something by which I can call you, I've done well. Because no one in this room, when asked to fill in personal information on a website, either puts their full name or any name or phone number or anything except a disposable email address. So let's face it, capturing this data can be tricky, even in the best of circumstances. But I believe that if we do a better job and we make it easier to do a better job, then we can affect the relationship we have with our customers and therefore improve the commercial outcome if that's what we're after, or the social outcome if that's what we prefer. And thankfully, the team at the Common Locale Data Repository project has been working on this for 20 years. And they have a huge repository of data that is supported by all of the largest organizations in the technology world, all of whom use this data repository to drive their customer engagement, which is typically why you find Facebook or Apple or Google or Amazon addresses you more comfortably in the units of measure and the date formats and the time and the money and currency that you care about. And when it works well, you don't think about it. And when it doesn't work well, it irritates you. And these become barriers and friction to actually getting a good business outcome. In the last 12 months, they've introduced a new section in the database for person names, which means that I've been able to implement that capability as part of this family of software. Not by any means the largest, most complicated, or most difficult project, but as always in anything to do with CLDR, fascinating about the cultural implications and the technology integration. Now, I've deliberately used different terminology when I've put names here. I've used first name, or given name, or forename, or family name, or last name, or surname. And at a certain point, we need to come to a common way to express a data model with certain terminology in order to make this work. The CLDR team has selected some names given and given to. I just have a natural aversion to things which are given to. So using this particular structure, I've selected names that are largely the same, but I hope a little bit more expressive where necessary. And whilst this does not cater for all names, if you look up the official name of King Charles III, it would actually be quite difficult to fit into any data model. But you could get close enough, and you could always say, hey, Chuck, if you wanted to go the informal communication route. So with credentials, I can capture all of the titles you have, PhD and all of the other things, and so on through the format. The idea being that this data model should be able to capture in sufficient detail and with sufficient separation the names of the majorities of cultures on the planet. CLDR encapsulates today 710 locales. It doesn't cover all of the languages and cultures in the world, but it covers the majority of ones that are likely to pay you money for software or services. Now, it's very, very likely that any software you're working with has at some point the notion of a person name or identity. And it's very unlikely you're going to be given a free hand to re-implement the way that you structure that data and serialize it. So as part of the library, I've also built a person name behavior so that you can take your existing data model and wrap a behavior around it so that it will work. And if you have no ability to influence the data model, you can also use a protocol so that the same thing will happen. So the idea being reduce the barrier to using existing data without having to move it into a different structure or different serialization. Okay, so now we understand, hopefully, or at least you understand my opinion on why names are important and why we should address people the way they wish. What are them? And we've got a data structure to store that information. What are the characteristics by which we can segment the way we address people? Well, I think the most obvious one is formality, formal or informal. Dear full legal name automatically tells me that I'm going to jail or I owe some tax. It's typically one of those two things. Dear Kip says you're probably asking for money or you want me to do you a favor. And there's a middle ground in there of adequate social engagement that might reflect some other approach. So the first thing that CLDR does is it says, okay, there's a formal way to talk to someone and an informal way to speak to someone. That's true in every culture, even if the distance between formality and informality is quite similar. The second attribute here is the idea of whether I'm talking to you or about you. And we typically, in common usage, talk differently to a person or whether we're talking about a person. The third one is the name order. This one is, I think, quite well understood. Some cultures put the given name first and the family name second. Some do it the other way around. And let's not forget that in some cases, let's say Japanese, where the name order is last name first name first, family name first, given name second, there's still the need to be able to address a foreigner in Japan. So when I was living in Japan, I need to get a letter from the Japanese tax department. So we can also associate a locale with a name that says, basically, I'm in Japan writing a Japanese letter, but I'm addressing this to someone who is not Japanese. And I can affect the word order and the spacing to understand that there is this cross-locale activity. Okay, we've got the basics. What the name order is, formal or informal, and whether I'm addressing you or I'm talking about you or to you. So we're going to get to some code in a moment. I'm sure that's a desirable objective. To do that, This is why we need to understand what's the formatting locale and what is the names locale, so that I can differentiate between whether I'm presenting a foreign name or a local name. And then I provide the parameters that I've already discussed. All of this data comes, as it always does with CLDR, in a huge XML database. Actually, it's a huge database that generates XML. I show this to you not so that you can take great joy in not having to deal with XML, of course, but to reflect, and here's an example from the Spanish locale, that in order to derive the pattern by which a name is generated relies not only on those attributes, formality, usage, and name order, but there are, in many cases, situations in which the data you have is incomplete. The data model says the only piece of data you need to have is a first name, given name. That's all. I mean, that goes right back to Adam and Manu and Pangu. Just the first name. And you can format a name in any culture according to any of those attributes, and it will generate for you a usable name based upon a single data type. But there are cases where you will have parts of data and some parts that are missing. So there are potentially multiple formats for each of these attributes. And then the algorithm says, compare the data you've got with the formats and use the format in which you have the most data that can fill in the blanks and has the least amount of blanks left over after you fill them in. So it's not just as simple as string template replacement, but selecting the right template based upon the data that you have, which is kind of fun. And just as a short aside, one of the reasons this project's taken longer than it should have is that, like all of the things in CLDR, it's based upon a set of rules and algorithms, none of which largely exist in the base Elixir implementation, for good reasons, which meant that, for example, when you're trying to create initials of people's names, the first thing you need to do is break a name into words. I've got multiple middle names. I need to break them into words. Okay. In most European languages, that's pretty straightforward. You just look for the white space and you break the words apart. Not so easy in Chinese or Japanese or Thai. No space, no space. So in order to make this work, the first thing was had to implement dictionary-based word breaking for the languages that don't have white space. That was a surprise I didn't expect, but it was a good fun implementation. After that, it turns out the algorithm relies upon certain regular expressions that are not expressible with the RE module in Erlang. So I had to implement a regular expression parser, which required introspection of Unicode. So like everything in CLDR, it's a fascinating travel down the rabbit hole. So what does that ultimately leave us with? So I've got now a live book that's in the repository. You can play with this at your heart's content. I can't imagine why you would right now, but just got to find a way to get a handle on this window to do that. So I realize that I am taking up more time than I should. So I've got 5 minutes to go by the maximal. This workbook starts out by letting you set the various formatting parameters. It will default everything quite happily. It'll default to medium. It'll use the name order that's relevant for the locale that you're formatting for. It will use informal if you don't specify formal on the basis that's more likely. And it uses referring to, as in talking about you, rather than addressing, rather than talking to you, on account of mostly you're probably going to be sending mails out to collect taxes or some other. So here's my locale is English. My format is medium. Across the entire CLDR libraries, I've tried to standardize on a terminology that says format as a way of describing primary format alternatives. It's typically short, medium, and long, and I default to medium. It may not be the perfect choice. I may revisit that, but those are the three choices. Name order, it can be surname first, given first, or sorting, depending upon whether you're just presenting a sorted list in a UI. Then usages, formal and informal. So in the repository, for testing reasons, as you'd expect, I've got quite a lot of names with various different bits of data in them. So for the moment, that's selectable. All this script is doing is formatting the test names into a pattern and then putting in the front of the pattern a random one, so that if you feel lucky, you can just pick a random name for the 20 or so that are in the list, and it'll select that. I've got one here because I know it's got a lot of data in it called JN, because I couldn't remember his full name, but his full name is down here. So Jean-Nicolas. And you can see that here's the structure I spoke about earlier, and he's got a fair bit of name in here. you'll see that his locale is the French locale because it's a French name. That's his natural locale, but I'm formatting in the English locale. So in this case, I'm going to format the name. So I'm reading the Keynote input. I'm calling toString, not too surprising. By the way, there is an implementation of the string.chars protocol. So you can just do toString on a name and it'll produce medium format, informal, refer. I can't remember if it's addressing or referring. So the idea being to make it really easy, just do toString on something. I do that for numbers. I do that for units. I do that for dates and times. I do that for everything in these libraries. And then, okay, in this case, we get Nico. All of that data, and it just becomes Nico because it's informal, medium, somebody we know. That's not quite so interesting. So what might we do? Well, let's generate all the names. There are ultimately a combination of 36 different ways that you can express how a name should be formatted. There's a fairly good chance lots of them will be the same because it's not necessarily true that the formats in a given culture are very different, and it's quite likely the data you have is incomplete. The idea is, however, that no matter what, if you can express the intent, we'll do the best that's possible with the data you give us. And if all you give is a given name, all you're likely to get back is a given name. In this case, however, what you do get back is 36 rows of nicely formatted data, I think, which gives you a sense of the expression here. So here we start out with short in addressing mode, given name first, and formal, and so on and so forth. I don't think going through all of this is useful to you, but you can see the variability based upon the intent, which I think is really quite expressive and a significant advancement on the typical commercial application that simply dumps out whatever it is you typed into to a screen, and will add all of the things that you need even beyond the bounds of the box. So please, by all means, have some fun with that. That's it on the demo side. I know that's a bit short, but that's as it should be. So some things are not in scope. Some languages like Latvian have inflected surnames, given that as inflected names not catered for. There are some ways that are culturally sensitive in the way you express. Fuji-san means is neutral formal. Sama means close friend. Can't tell the difference in this package. You'll have to work that out. That's up to you. Titles and generation terms and standardizing those, very difficult. In fact, even before CLDR, I spent months trying to find a way to do this. So far, not really practical. Humans are just messy. And there's also no way to express alternative names for different personas, more formality, and parsing is just really complicated. As an example, as you can well imagine, if presented with a name, I don't know where the given names end and the surnames start. That's beyond the bounds. So capturing names will remain difficult. Also, what's not covered, but I'd really like to tackle because I just think it's interesting, is salutations, i.e. how I say to you, dear Fred, and a valediction, which is the other end, which says, warmly yours. I put two examples because French is just super expressive in both of these things. Most illustrious and most eminent lord is how you address a cardinal in France. I don't know any cardinals, but you may find this handy, or you may not. And valedictions as a way to sign off. Please accept, Madam, Sir, the expression of my distinguished sentiments, which is something you're sure to put in your next Twitter post. And the last one is personas, which I do think is tackleable, which is to say that the name structure you saw is for a single persona. If you've got an online presence or a gaming or a social or some other role or job, then I think it's useful to be able to bundle all of those up and say, here's an identity of multiple personas, and I added an additional level that says pick the persona, so that if you're going to speak to your homie about the rap party, then you can express that persona as opposed to whatever the formal name is when you're the tax department. All of this is coming out based upon CLDR 45 data. They release 2 releases a year. April is always the first one. That comes out in the next couple of weeks. It's in beta now. That will be in the base library, EXCLDR 2.38, so that will come out the same day. And EX Person Names is built on that data platform, so it will come out then. But if you're feeling experimental and you have, for some strange reason, motivation to take a look, then if you configure it from GitHub, you'll be fine. It'll pull in all the transitive dependencies and do what you need. And lastly, if for some reason you want to find me because you found this talk curious or you'd like to hurl abuse, you can use both the formal or informal forms of address. I'm completely comfortable with both. Just remember, it's addressing and not referring when you write to me directly, and we'll all have a good time. So thank you all very much. And Mike, sorry for being 4 minutes over. I will now stop sharing.